And now we come to this. It was inevitable. This one, more than all the others, I must preface with, this is entirely my opinion. I still think this game is a very good, well-made game. I have nothing against people enjoying it. I think it's great that people enjoy it. I personally didn't enjoy it very much, but that is just my opinion. So, this is a game that everyone was talking about when it came out, and I decided to get it, basically just to tide the time over until the release of Persona 5, which is the game that I was really looking forward to this year, and because I'd played every other game in the series, so I might as well try this one. And, well, yeah. For many people, this was their game of the year. This was one of the most phenomenal achievements in gaming period, and a breath of fresh air for the series. To me personally, this became one of my least favourite games of all time, and one of the few games, very few games, I have ever expressed genuine hatred towards. That game was The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Let me just say first, if you like this style of game, this is a fantastic, well-made game. It's really amazing. Definitely play it if you're into this sort of thing. But I'm not into this sort of thing. In general, I don't like open-world games very much. Okay, wait, let me rephrase that. I don't like open-world games where the main draw of the game is just the open world. I love Xenoblade Chronicles, for example. It's my favourite RPG ever. But I love it not for its big world, but for its story, characters, side quests, and battle system. To put that in perspective, Xenoblade Chronicles X, which heavily downplayed all of those things, I quit playing that game halfway through. I tend to get bored of open world games very quickly. It's a little hard to describe why, but it's just the kind of person that I am. I'm the kind of person who likes rigid order and structure in games. I like to always be working towards some concrete, clearly defined goal when I play a game. Be that progressing the story, getting 100% completion, or things like that. And admittedly, those aspects are there in Breath of the Wild, but they're all very heavily downplayed. There was an interesting video that I watched recently, a video where Jay Witz compares the three major 3D Mario games before Super Mario Odyssey came out. Sunshine, Galaxy, and 64, and he said that Sunshine and 64 he liked a lot more than Galaxy for their levels, in his words, giving you more opportunity to goof off, and just kind of play around and do your own thing. This may be why I don't like open world games very much. I am really not big on quote-unquote goofing off when I play a game. Whenever I put hours into a game, I feel like I have to be making concrete, clearly definable progress. Breath of the Wild is a game that I could spend as much as 5 hours in a single play session and not have anything to show for that time besides a couple of Korok seeds. To me, that is not a very productive use of my precious time. I'll never really explore just for the sake of exploration in the game. Seeing big, beautiful scenery is never anything that attracts me to a game. I feel like if I wanted to do that, I'd just go to a national park in real life. Another aspect of open world games that tends to make me dislike them, it's very hard to tell a good story in them, when the player can stumble into any fragment of the story at any point. Breath of the Wild takes a very similar approach to storytelling that a lot of open world games I know of do. There's one main story thread that's extremely basic. In this case, get to Hyrule Castle, beat Ganon. There are a bunch of scattered, minor moments throughout the game that you're free to discover on your own that kind of relate to that, but overall there's not very much story. In this case, it kind of bothered me that the vast majority of the most interesting parts of the plotline all happened in the past. Some of the flashbacks are pretty awesome, but they just kept making me wish that that was the actual story and not just the backstory. With the possible exception of Prince Sidon, all the remotely interesting characters to me have been either dead or sealed for 100 years. While to me Zelda games have never really been known for their good storylines, often they have a lot of characters that I really enjoy, and this one sort of lacked that. Though I will say, for the first ever Zelda with voice acting, I quite like the majority of the voice acting in the game. So, story is downplayed in this one, and that's one big minus for me. You know what else is heavily downplayed? Every other thing I loved about Zelda. When I play Zelda, I don't play it for the exploration. I play it for the dungeons, the creative item-based puzzles, and the combat system, sometimes. All of these are heavily downplayed in Breath of the Wild. I wasn't really a big fan of 120 mini-dungeons. Sure, there were 4 major dungeons, but I didn't really enjoy many of them that much, except maybe the fire one. Some people might not like item-based puzzles because once you figure them out once, they're the same every time. But to me, that's just part of the thrill of Zelda. Seeing what new things you can do when you unlock a new ability. This game had to keep the puzzles fairly generic physics-based affairs, so that no matter when in the game you found them, you could solve them. To me, a lot of these puzzles just did not feel like Zelda puzzles. They felt like they'd be more at home in a Portal game than a Zelda one. If anything, these shrines felt like the kind of thing you could make in a level editor. In fact, it's a bit of a missed opportunity that there isn't one of those. Losing the item progression also bothered me. In Zelda games, I really love the feeling that you get when you find a new item in a dungeon. You realize what it can be used to do. You remember all those places in the world that you couldn't progress, and now realize, wow, I can do this, and this now. Look how much of the world has opened up to me. And it keeps progressing like that gradually throughout the game. By contrast, Breath of the Wild hand all of the major glyphs on your Sheikah slate to you right from the start and basically says, hey, the entire world open to you right now. Personally, I find this less satisfying than having the world gradually open up to you in more of a Metroidvania style. It's just sort of less special to discover new places when you can already go everywhere from the beginning. Combat. I might be alone here, but I didn't really enjoy the combat system all that much. Now, I love all the hilarious and creative ways you can kill enemies, like starting fires in camps, blowing up explosive barrels, suspending rocks over enemies' heads with the stasis rune and dropping them. Those are all kind of fun, but I found the core combat with weapons to be a little bit lacking, mainly because, I don't know, I found that mastering all of the different styles of weapons just didn't feel like there was much point to it when every weapon was temporary. If I found a combat style that I really liked, I wouldn't be able to use it for very long. You only get a permanent weapon of the basic sword type. Sure, you can reforge the champion weapons, but they require some pretty rare resources. Anyway, the general combat felt a little bit disappointing to me. Just mash the attack button, occasionally dodge with good timing. I vastly preferred Skyward Sword's really interesting motion control combat system, particularly the way that different enemies reacted to different types of strikes. I do like what they did with some classic Zelda enemies like Hinoxes and Lynels. I think this is the debut of both those enemies in a 3D Zelda, and what they did with them was actually pretty cool, although admittedly Hinoxes were pretty easy once you learned how to actually fight them. Even Lynels, once you had the perfect dodge timing down, I didn't find Lynels, not even silver ones, to be that difficult. Another thing that I wasn't a big fan of in this game, the music. Now, what few full songs there were on the soundtrack are all amazing, but the minimalistic music throughout most of the game, I just didn't really like it all that much. I understand why they did this. Having full soundtracks would get very, very grating in a game with this much exploration. But whenever I play a game, the music is always a huge part of an area's character. And I'll grow to love an area or location a lot more if it has a very good music track associated with it. And there have been games I played with huge worlds that still have full soundtracks for every area. Xenoblade Chronicles X, for example. That world is massive, yet every region still has its own full song. And none of them really got grating to me when I was playing that game. I think even among people who do like Breath of the Wild, the soundtrack is still pretty controversial. I've seen people passionately defending it, and I've also seen people quite disliking it. So, I don't think I'm alone here. Also, yes, there is a ton to do in this game, and I appreciate it for just having so much content. But it's hard to describe. I never really felt much attachment to any of the NPCs or the side quests in this game. It's not like Majora's Mask, where the side quests just made me really grow to love the world so much. Here, not even Tarry Town really engaged me emotionally. I just didn't feel that invested in any of the locations in this world, or any of the NPCs or side quests. Speaking of the world itself, that's another issue that I'm probably gonna get horribly lynched for, but personally, I don't find the world to be that interesting. Aside from the major towns, and the snowy areas, which I kinda liked how they worked, I just found most of the world to be boring generic plains, boring generic mountains, boring generic rivers. Comparing that to, say, the first Xenoblade Chronicles, which had a really awesome variety of different environments, I just didn't enjoy exploring this one all that much. And I think my lack of enjoyment with this game can be summed up from a paraphrase quote from the TV Tropes Your Mileage May Vary page for the game. It says that this is a game that caters to only one kind of Zelda fan, at the exclusion of all others. If you like Zelda for the exploration, you'll adore this game, but if not, there's really not much in it for you. To be fair, Skyward Sword was pretty similar, though the exact opposite extreme. And the fact that I absolutely adored Skyward Sword, it's my favourite game in the series by far, it was pretty inevitable that I wouldn't like this one. I felt like Ocarina of Time had the perfect balance. It balanced exploration, story, characters, dungeons, combats. It had an even amount, roughly, of all of them. Because of that, it's a game that any kind of Zelda fan can enjoy, regardless of which aspects of the series you like. This game, I feel they focused way too heavily on one of those, namely the exploration. And this is just another personal thing, but to me, they focus on that aspect far more than any previous game ever has, to the point where the game barely even felt like Zelda to me. I know that Zelda means different things to different people, and I know that Zelda 1 essentially invented the open world genre. But if you go back and play Zelda 1's dungeons today, you can still see the roots of the style of dungeons that would be in later games. Despite its heavy focus on a huge world, Zelda 1 still felt like it had that essence of Zelda to me. Whereas with this game, the entirety of the way that I played this one, not once did I feel like I was playing a Zelda game. I felt like I was playing a generic open world game with a Zelda coat of paint slapped on it. That sounds extremely harsh, I know, but it is genuinely how I feel. I literally called this Zelda in name only many times while I was playing it. There are a lot of people out there who felt the series really needed this. They felt that the formula was getting stale and that it needed a complete overhaul. As you can tell, I personally didn't think this. I'll compare this to Pokemon Black and White. Now, Black and White are my favourite games in the Pokemon series, partly because they were so innovative. And I felt the series really needed that because I did feel that by the time of Gen 4, Pokemon was getting stale. And so I liked how Game Freak was bold enough to go for a big shake-up. Here though, I personally didn't feel that the Zelda formula was getting stale. Or it might have slightly been, but it definitely didn't need such a drastic reboot as this. Breath of the Wild essentially obliterates everything about the franchise that existed previously and starts again from scratch. To me, this kind of drastic reboot is only justified in the case where the franchise had an installment so absurdly horrible that it really needed to just completely start again. Like, say, Batman Begins versus Batman and Robin. But I didn't feel like any of the most recent Zelda games were that awful. I mean, I didn't care for Triforce Heroes very much, but that was more of a spin-off. I know there were some people in the fanbase who did think that, though, and I don't know, I just feel like maybe they listened only to the vocal minority? Just to throw away pretty much everything that was previously established with this franchise almost feels a bit insulting to people who actually like those elements. To me, there was already a Zelda game that refreshed the stale formula while still not being too drastic about it, and that game was A Link Between Worlds. Link Between Worlds was a game that I did not expect to like. When I first heard they were doing a direct sequel to Link to the Past, I thought, oh no, this is going to be a nostalgia pandering fest that is going to be entirely stuck in the past. But no, it actually felt like its own thing despite sharing the art style of a past game. Adding back in the ability to do the dungeons in any order, but without really sacrificing much in the way of story. Changing it so you rented items, so you could access different parts of the world whenever you wanted to, while still keeping those items the basic kind of puzzle-solving tools they have always been in Zelda. I thought that it was the perfect combination of a big step forward, but not a total reboot. And I kind of wish they continued in that style. Yeah, I seem a little bit hypocritical here, in that I'll bash games for being too stuck in the past and not wanting to innovate, but I'll bash games for innovating too much, but it really is a balancing act to me. I like it when games innovate on their formulas, but not to the point where they get rid of everything, both good and bad, from the existing formula. And the fact that this game has been explosively successful means that we're unlikely to see many of those elements of the original formula ever again, and that does make me kind of sad. However, I will say this is entirely my personal opinion. I personally don't like the aspects of the Zelda series that this game focused on the most. And the aspects of the series that I do like are aspects that this one downplayed or destroyed entirely. To people who do like Zelda for the exploration, though, this is a very good game. I'm not mad that people like this game. I think people are allowed to like this game. I'm glad that people like this game. I'm glad this game was such a big seller for the Switch. Like, I'm not going to say that it is physically impossible to like this game unless you're lying to yourself. That is disgusting and wrong. This game was not the kind of game that I enjoy. As a result, I obviously didn't enjoy this game very much. That does not make it a bad game. Obviously, I am not the only person in the world. I just have a different opinion on this game to many other people. You will probably have a different opinion than me on this game, and that's a good thing. So, overall, in terms of a game in its own right, I definitely give this game a 5 out of 5. In terms of how much I personally enjoyed the game, 2 out of 5, bordering on a 1 out of 5. I should mention, I actually did get all 120 shrines, which is more than a lot of people who do like the game, which is kind of weird. I mean, when I play a game, even if I don't like it that much, I'll usually go all out in completion. Well, I mean, there are limits, I'm not going to go for all the Korok seeds. But I did end up quitting just before the final boss, because I just tend to get bored of open world games. But quick thing, there are a couple of complaints that I have with this game that I feel are objective complaints. Things that actually are badly designed. Firstly, the weather. The weather, as some people have said, is sentient and actively out to troll you. I know there are some areas that are always raining, and that I like, but the random rain can really screw you over when you're trying to climb a mountain or something, and it just doesn't feel like a good mechanic to me. Secondly, one specific part of the memory side quest. One of the photos you're given as a hint to find one of the memories is just a forest with no other landmarks visible. Yeah, good luck finding which of the game's 100+ forests that is. Yeah, seriously, if you find that one without a guide, I don't even know what to think. It also hurts that one of the memories is in Hyrule Castle, so you either have to go there early or save completing the memory quest until the final dungeon. Anyway, those are the only things that I can think of the game that I'd really consider objectively bad. So again, 5 out of 5 game as a game overall, but I didn't personally like it very much. The next game that I played in 2017 was one that I've been looking forward to for a very, very long time. Persona 5. I already have 2 full videos explaining my thoughts on this game in detail. One with story spoilers, one without story spoilers. So go and check those out if you want my full opinion. Here I'll just give a brief rundown. Persona 5 is such a stylish game overall. The menus, the battle interface, just the general design of everything, all evoke a great aesthetic. The battle system is very fast-paced while still maintaining the same strategy of earlier games in the series. The gameplay is a radical improvement on Persona 4, which itself was a radical improvement on Persona 3. I enjoyed the confidant system for the most part. I felt that giving them actual gameplay benefits was really cool, and the way that all of the confidants were tied into the story, rather than just being random people that you just happen to meet at school, who have no relation to the overall plot, was also really cool and made a lot of them a lot more memorable than they really should have been. Admittedly, some of the confidant bonuses were much better than others, and some were nearly useless, like Devil, while others, like the rank 10 of Strength, were incredibly game-breaking. The overall story was decent. I didn't feel that it was the best storyline in the series, but I will say the pacing of the plot was a lot better than Persona 3 or 4. There weren't that many huge stretches of time where nothing much happened. The one exception being Summer Vacation. For some reason, they gave you an abnormally large time limit for the 4th dungeon, and it's a pretty short dungeon too. So if you finish it early, you're left with a huge stretch of time where barely anything happens, and because it's school holidays, there aren't many confidants available to you. Other than that though, the pacing is pretty great. There's just enough downtime between dungeons to help you recuperate, while they still get straight into the next major story beat pretty quickly, especially with the framing device of the interrogation. The villains were all pretty decent, as were their boss fights, though I felt that some of the bosses weren't quite as good as the ones in Persona 4. A lot of them felt quite easy to me as well. The characters, personally, I didn't find quite as good as Persona 3 or 4's, but they're all pretty decent, and the game does a better job of tying most of them to the plot than Persona 4 did. The main exceptions are Yusuke and Haru. Yusuke's plot is pretty much swept under the rug after he's recruited, and he spends the rest of the game with nothing much to do other than be comic relief. While Haru is very deeply tied to the plot, a lot of her connections to it are pretty much glossed over after she joins and aren't focused on nearly as much as they should be. And of course, joining so late into the story means that she doesn't get very much development. In my opinion, one of the biggest flaws with this game was the localization. The English voice actors all do a pretty good job, but the actual dialogue is very awkwardly written and in many places shows signs of a very rushed translation. At some points, there are even typos still left in the script, and I don't mean just random typos you won't see unless you go out of your way. I mean typos during voiced cutscenes, where they're really glaring. A lot of the lines just don't read naturally in English. To me, the mark of a lackluster localization is when I can look at a line and instantly think, that probably made more sense in Japanese. As I said in my thoughts video, this bothers me for a few reasons. Firstly, Persona 3 and 4 had some of the best localizations of any game I've played, in my opinion. Secondly, this game has a fairly decent story, so a lackluster localization dragging it down just really hurts. Thirdly, this game's English release was delayed twice just to improve the localization, and it still ended up like this. Despite that though, I still think this is an amazing game, though I don't agree with it winning any Game of the Year 2017 awards, only because, going by the Japanese release, it's technically a 2016 game. But I will say this, coming to the end of the year and looking back, Persona 5 is one of 2 games I played this year that gave me the most joy. The time I spent this year playing Persona 5 was all just a genuinely happy time for me. I still look back on it fondly. Heck, after I beat the game, I even missed my time playing it. It's always great when you find a game like that, and because of that, I'd say I give this game a 5 out of 5 in terms of my personal impression. I don't think it's a flawless game by any means, but it is one of the games that I enjoyed the most this year. I suppose next up would be a game that I also did a full set of thoughts videos on, so I also will just give a brief rundown on. Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. This is a game that I still get requests when I'm going to be doing a playthrough of it. Unfortunately, I just didn't really enjoy this game as much as I'd hoped. I kind of treat it like the inverse of Fate's Conquest, which to me had really phenomenal gameplay, but a pretty weirdly written story. However, because the gameplay and map design was so great in that one, I came out of Conquest still enjoying it. Echoes to me fit into the opposite TV trope. Enjoy the story, skip the game. I'd say that Echoes is a huge step forward for the series in terms of writing and voice acting. I was really worried when I heard this game had full voice acting, even in normal dialogue, because Fire Emblem had never done that before, and I felt like this could easily go very, very badly. But all the voice actors had amazing performances in this one. They delivered every line nearly perfectly. Their timing was great in comedic moments. They got the serious moments right. It is honestly some of the best voice acting I've ever heard in the game. The dialogue is also written extremely well. And to me, it's 8-4 redeeming themselves after, well, I'm in the minority and didn't really like Awakening's localization very much, but let's not go into that. For the most part, the new additions they made to the existing game's storyline were all pretty good. Fleshing out a few villains like Jeddah and Slade, who were fairly generic in the original game. There are some additions to the plot that I wasn't a big fan of, though, particularly how Celica's arc ended. This is a radical departure from the original Gaiden, taking Celica's character in a direction that made her a lot less likable to some people. And it leads to a resolution that's essentially pointless, because it's undone right afterwards and is never spoken of again. I'm actually not entirely sure whether I'd consider this better or worse than Celica just being a straight-up damsel in distress in the final dungeon, like she was in the original Gaiden, and that's really saying something. Also, from what I remember, Alm was a lot more of a flawed character in the original Gaiden, and a lot of his hatred towards Regalians was downplayed a lot in the remake. Which is kind of disappointing, because that would have made a certain revelation even more powerful if they'd kept that aspect of his character. I still don't mind Alm, especially due to his really great examine dialogue and village scenes. Gameplay-wise, though, Echoes didn't really engage me as much as Fire Emblem games usually do. Just to get the positives out of the way first, I will say I loved how they handled dungeons. Those were pretty great. But the actual battle maps overall, and even the battle system, it kept most of the archaic mechanics from the original Gaiden. There's no weapon triangle at all, and there's also no true hit. For those who don't know what true hit is, basically in later Fire Emblem games, the game rolls two random numbers when determining hit rate and averages them. What this means is that higher hit rates are skewed towards hitting more, and lower hit rates are skewed more towards missing. The lack of that means that it's much easier to get screwed over by bad luck in Echoes. Especially as terrain provides ridiculous bonuses, and some classes like archers have very low base accuracy. I didn't mind the cast from hit points magic system and the fact that it ignores terrain bonuses, but what I did mind is the fact that which characters learn which spells is still a complete guide, dang it. This can make it annoying when deciding what to promote the villagers to, and also the fact that there is no indication that Faye is the only one to learn the Anew spell, so you really should make her a cleric. I didn't know this and made her a Pegasus Knight, so yeah. But it's not just the mechanics that I wasn't a fan of. The map design in this game is not the best. There are a lot of just flat, featureless plains without much in the way of terrain. Out of all the maps that I played throughout the main story, really the only two that stand out to me are Greed Citadel and Nui Barbar's Abode. And the second one, probably for all the wrong reasons. Also, there's a real lack of variety in enemy class types. Most maps just consist of, like, just Cavaliers or just Armors. And monster enemies are also a little bit hit and miss, because there's actually a lot of them that you'll probably never see unless you do some really extensive grinding or play the post-game. Class balance was also a bit off. Without the weapon triangle, certain classes lost their unique edge. Dread Fighters have way too much movement and a resistance to magic, essentially making them the best at everything, while mages are stuck with a measly 4 move even after promotion, and this includes Celica. Man, that was annoying. Which is made worse by the fact that unlike some Fire Emblem games, mages don't have free movement over certain types of terrain, like deserts. The skill system was also kind of weird. I didn't find myself using it all that much, aside from one or two skills that were incredibly overpowered, like Hunter's Volley and Alm's Twin Lion Strike. The skills that gave you automatic double attacks, basically. Speaking of which, I was also not a fan of how you only needed one speed above the target to double. So, all in all, Echoes' gameplay just didn't really engage me very much. I found myself getting kinda bored towards the end, and it was only the story and voice acting that kept me going on. Weird thing is, Echoes is actually giving me new appreciation for Shadow Dragon. I used to really hate Shadow Dragon for not doing enough to spice up the original's generic plot, and not having support conversations, meaning that the vast majority of the cast didn't even say anything unless they died. And while I still really hate its side quest system, I now appreciate the fact that it wasn't afraid to modernize the gameplay. They changed stats to work more like the way they do in the newer games. They added in the weapon triangle, and better variety in weapons. They gave axe classes actual promotions, and added in the Myrmidon and Swordmaster classes. Echoes is kind of the opposite, doing a lot to fix the original's story, but barely changing much of the gameplay. Because of this, Echoes is definitely not my favourite game in the series by a long shot. In fact, if it weren't for its great voice acting and writing, it would probably be pretty near the bottom for me. For those who keep asking, this is why I have no plans to do a playthrough of Echoes anytime soon. I know that it's a new game and a lot of people are asking me to do it, but I just don't enjoy the game that much compared to other Fire Emblem games, so I feel that I wouldn't be very enthusiastic about it. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are a higher priority for me. I still think, though, that if the next Fire Emblem game combines Conquest's gameplay with Echoes' approach to story, characters, and voice acting, it would be pretty close to perfect. Let's just hope they do something like that. The next game I played this year, well, it's yet another one that I've done a full thoughts video on. This is about where I started with The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. And well, since there are 3 games to catch up on, I pretty much continue with those games from around mid this year. To date it via this channel, I started FC around the time I started recording Sacred Stones. And as of now, I'm a little over halfway through the 3rd. But I did end up really loving these games, and I go into my full thoughts, well, not exactly my full thoughts, since I didn't talk about story and characters in those thoughts videos, but the reason I didn't make a separate video to discuss spoilers there is because much less people have played the Sky games than have played Persona 5. And so I feel like I'd rather save my thoughts on those games' stories until I actually record and play through those games, which I do plan on doing someday. So again, I'll just be brief here. I really love these games. They have great stories and characters, amazing music, a pretty good battle system, and great world building. But I guess I could take this time to address one thing. When I did put up my thoughts video, a lot of people were very mad that I suggested skipping FC. I'm thinking back now, and that might have been a hasty thing for me to say. Personally, I feel like I'd still be able to follow the second game's plot if I hadn't played the first one, but I am almost disturbingly plot savvy, and not everyone is like that, so I really shouldn't have assumed that everyone would catch on to the plot as well as I did. The thing is, though, I do admit that a lot of SC will not have as much impact to you if you didn't play the first game. But it's not so much for the actual plot. Like I said, I do feel like FC barely has any plot to speak of. What the actual point of FC is you spend time with these characters initially before things really go downhill. And because of that, what happens to these characters in the second game affects you more because you're more personally attached to them. This I was kind of forgetting, and realizing this now, I am annoyed that I encourage people to skip the first game. The thing is, I still didn't enjoy FC nearly as much as I did SC. I still feel like FC is incredibly slow-paced from a plot perspective. As I said in my thoughts video, barely anything of significance happens in FC's plot until the very end. It's practically just a slice-of-life game up until then. Essentially, it's an entire game spent establishing the foundations for the real story that happens in the second game. And as such, I feel it doesn't work very well as a standalone game, and that's why I personally don't consider it as good of a game as the second one. Again, I found Cold Steel 1 to be different. It also established the foundations for the second game, but I still felt that it still worked well as a standalone game. There I felt Cold Steel 2 was only very slightly better than Cold Steel 1, whereas SC is so phenomenally better than FC, there's really no comparison. There were very few moments in the first Sky game that made me say, wow, this is really awesome. Whereas in SC, I spent almost the entire game in a constant state of that. My opinion on FC was probably affected by the fact that I went into it already spoiled on the cliffhanger ending. So the majority of me playing it was spent just going, come on, get to the good part already. I don't know if you really understand what I'm saying here, it's just that me personally, I have very little tolerance for plots that spend ages not going anywhere. So for me, FC was kind of a waiting game to get to the real action. It is worth it to have a big connection to what happens in the second game, but I still feel like the second game is so vastly better than the first one. But in some ways, that's only because the first game laid the foundation so strongly, so I can see where people are coming from. So anyway, in terms of how much I rate these games of overall enjoyment, FC I'd only give a 2.5 out of 5, SC 4.5 or even an outright 5. As for the third, I plan to give my full thoughts on that game when I actually finish it, but I've actually been really enjoying the third. To some extent, maybe even more than SC. It doesn't reuse locations as much as the first two Sky games do, so there's quite a bit of new stuff to deal with. And I love how every character from the previous games gets some closure in this one. I will say though, you will not enjoy the third if you haven't played both FC and SC. It's really more of a fan service game than anything else. It was actually said on the localizer's official blog that the third only has one target audience, people who've played both the previous Sky games, and I'd fully agree there. So I would not under any circumstances recommend playing this as your first Sky game. But expect a full thoughts video on that game once I'm done with it.